So I want to just briefly explain, Thomas, that this is an unfinished chapter of a book we're working on with Paul and Greg Michelson. So I'm writing on what they call continental philosophy, in terms of, kind of creating a genealogy of materialism, of materialist thought. So they're working on, materialism, mathematics and computing. Paul is fixated on this idea that there is, way too much idealism in mathematics, but we can identify certain materialist thinkers. So it's, I'm doing the same kind of archaeological digging out of certain layers of thought that are usually conflated with different concepts or taken as a unity of this conglomerate of concepts as we receive it, and have the inertia of understanding them in modernity. So I'm trying to unpack them in terms of antiquity in particular. So not just the language, not just the philosophy of the era, but also the era itself, the historical context itself. So I'm kind of doing a philosophical work there, and mainly rereading Marx through these lenses, and the two of them are working on mathematics and scientific models of explanation. So whatever I discover in Parmenides, or I don't know, in Epicurus, they are looking for it in Boltzmann, etc. So it's a different, it's an interesting and different process from what I've experienced before. So this chapter is unfinished. You could see there that I have notes to myself, notes to self. They're remaining. I forgot to remove them, so it's unfinished. But you kind of, have a grasp of what I'm trying to do there. There is also another chapter on Parmenides, which would have been maybe useful to share as well for more context. Okay, I'm not. I'm trying here not to repeat myself from the first two classes, not to keep making the same points. For example, the point I'm making here about dialectics is a point I made in the first two classes I gave as part of this program, as part of our course, actually. But those points were made through a certain type of close reading of okay, do not circulate it, Jorge. Okay, I will share it between us, right? Because the others too might kill me if they knew I keep circulating the files like this. It's still under review, so anyway, it's probably going to be published by Zero Books, which is interesting. They have never published such a boring book so far. But anyway, so so where was I? I presented an analysis of how Marx operates with the notion of dialectics through a close reading of different works of his from different stages of his of the development. The system here, the telecom itself, does a certain restart, this 12 hours restart, and it's between 6 and 6:30. I think that's what happened. That's why I got back so easily quickly. Okay, so yes, observing the supposed epistemological break, I tried to cover all stages in Marxist work and present my reading, according to which dialectics is something different to Marx than what it was to Hegel. I drew my arguments there mainly from this early text called The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy in General, but I could identify similar arguments in favor of this thesis of this reading in German ideology, in Grundrisse, even in Capital, and we went through those. So what is the main argument we find in, for example, in Hegel's critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, which is almost verbatim repeated in German ideology, only in a more succinct form, that supports this thesis. It is, it has to do with something that I called Marx's critique of subjectivity-centered thinking, subjectivity-centered thought, subjectivity as the organizing principle of thought. His attack in critique of Hegel's philosophy in general is precisely against this concept itself of subject and subjectivity. And his argument there is that that subject or subjectivity or the idea or spirit, for example, take the notion of spirit in Hegel. It's structurally, let me use that word, it is not a reflection, a product of, or has the constitution, let's put it that way, has the constitution of human subjectivity. It mines the constitution, the way human subjectivity or subject as it was conceived by, as the notion was conceived by Marx back then, or as it was available at the time, the concept of subject, this subject. I think that actually until then, no one used the term subject to denominate the self, the human self, and so much more. No one used it as much as Marx did. And it is for a good reason, because by doing so, he could make this categorical distinction between human self, a supposed objective idealism, etc., because the notion of the subject allows him a purely formal analysis of what is going on when Hegel speaks of the spirit, or when he proposes, puts forward the thesis of some sort of objective ideal, the existence of spirit in and of itself, in and for itself. So the notion of the subject, and as opposed to object and objectivity, he operates with this contradiction and distinction all the time in this paper, that enables Marx to identify the fact, recognize the fact that this spirit, this objective idea embodying objective actualizations of all, of all existing, is nothing but structurally, or by its constitution and mode of operation, a mimesis of I'm using the word mimesis, he does not operate with it, of the human subject, human subjectivity. And that is why he insists in this paper, as well as, I'm calling it a paper, it's just one of the manuscripts in the early 1844 manuscripts. But the same argument reappears later on. Some of those arguments are cited in the paper I sent you for this class, I believe. The two quotes from Grundrisse, I think, support this understanding. Now it will become clear why. By its constitution, it could be nothing but human subjectivity. That is why, according to Marx, this spirit, this ideal, the objective ideal embodying everything, reality itself and the meaning of reality, and being a sublimation of both existence and essence, as Marx would put it in his dissertation, that it is nothing but a philosophical projection of anthropocentrism. He does not use this word, but I am using it, as it is the projection of human subjectivity elevated to the level of being objective reality itself. This analysis is present in the paper I'm citing. I have in mind mainly this critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, and that is why he says at one point that, this is a paraphrasis, that what Hegel postulates is, there is primarily the universal egoist, the humanity as the universal egoist, or the ideal of the human subject as the universal egoist. That is there in that paper, but it reappears elsewhere. And that is why, through this indirectly, not indirectly, in different words, Marx is a thinker who attacks anthropocentrism, even when he advocates most strongly in favor of radical humanism. He is still not an anthropocentric, thanks to these reasons. On top of everything, I will arrive now to the point about objectivity or third party's perspective, and that will kind of shed light as to why the quotes I'm mentioning from Grundrisse, and I think German ideology in the paper I sent you for this class, make sense and are somehow connected, part and parcel of the same argument I'm making here. So in this early paper, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy in General, in Grundrisse, is in German ideology, in the part where he's criticizing the false materialism of Feuerbach, he's advocating for a position of thought that is that of third party's perspective. We ought to, he argues, assume, mime. We anyway have to mime, this is my intervention, we anyway have to mime one or the other form, either subjectivity or objectivity. We have to mime the stance of a third-party perspective, looking at ourselves as objects among objects. That is how we can be radical humanists and still not anthropocentric. Objects among objects in a certain flat ideology, or according to such an ideology, but also see other object of discussion as objects among objects. And we have this, let's say, originary alienation at hand, available through language. This is my argument, through language mainly, that also already renders the human subject and object to itself. So I think that this possibility is implicitly present in Marx's text. Actually, this type of analysis is implicitly present in his, or the possibility of such analysis is present in his own text. But even without it, we can still arrive to the conclusion about objectivity conceived in the way I just presented. And it is, I think, more than evident that he is explicit in raising the problem, or the epistemological problem of the centrality of subjectivity in all hitherto existing philosophy, as he would say, having its apex in Hegel. So that is what I kept explaining in the first two sessions. So this elaboration as to why this is not anthropocentric thinking, as to why we have to move away from subjectivity, individuality, etc., centered thinking, and still be capable of being radical humanist and forging strong links of humanists and forging strong links of social solidarity, seeing ourselves as part of social, of the social relations Marx talks about, is a certain possibility. Therefore, this type of let's tentatively call it dialectics is what is at the center of Marx's episteme, and this a radical difference from Hegel in terms of epistemology, in terms of what I would tentatively call a metaphysical choice. Even though Marx is not a metaphysician, he makes a certain metaphysical choice, matter in favor of idea, objectivity in favor of subjectivity, centered thinking, etc., etc. So this choice that Marx makes, and this distancing from Hegel at the core, let's say, at the heart, he kind of puts a knife at the heart of Hegel's key argument, the key argument of his phenomenology, and the concept and the centrality of the concept of dialectics there makes Marx so much different and already leads us to a different understanding of the notion of dialectics. We never see Marx use thesis and synthesis and this type of terminology. His understanding of movement and changes best described perhaps by Thomas and his kinetic materialism, which is something quite different from dialectical materialism. But there is use of dialectics there, and I would say this use of dialectics is mainly methodological. Marx takes dialectics in the original Greek sense of the word, I would say, as a method. And when he mentions Hegel wants, and that's in German ideology, I think, as the great master of the method of dialectics. He uses the word method, and then when he attacks the young Hegelians for improperly using the method, the attack is on the method, or what Aristotle would say, the correct way of thinking. So this chapter tries to, so I have like 5 more minutes, but I think I can wrap up by then. So this chapter tries to demonstrate this unfinished chapter I sent you of mine, tries to demonstrate that this has been the position of Marx all along, since his dissertation. Even in the dissertation itself, he uses the term dialectics in the Greek sense of the word mainly, even though there is an influence of Hegel there. There here and there shades, let's say shades of ontologization, a little spontaneous moves of ontologization of what is supposed to be a method, which is dialectics. But essentially, it remains even there a method, even though in the German text we can see that he uses several times the word Aufheben, Aufhebung, etc. Even though even in Hegel, Aufheben and Aufhebung is not necessarily dialectics in the way we understand it through Damat. It's more like, you know, contradiction leading to sublation, leading to a certain type of sublimation. It's just a tentative use of a word, the last one. So even in Hegel, Aufheben is not exactly that. But let's say it's still a phenomenology. The method has been projected outwards onto the outside reality, and it constitutes a universe, just like the subjectivity in Hegel's thinking, according to Marx. So it's the same move and the same problem. And it would be the same problem for Marx, because as I argued here and in the previous classes, he mainly operates with the notion in the original Greek sense of the word, and mainly as a method. Still, there is influence from Hegel on young Marx, and we can see that there is something which resembles ontologization of the argument, but he still manages to remain essentially materialist and not to ontologize entirely, or not at all, his method. That remains a method. Why? Because the concept of atom, for example, is basically meaningless. I mean, it does not have a reality unless materialized through properties, as he puts it. So this predication of properties of how things are as qualities, let's say, and in Aristotelian terms, as to how they are toward a certain toon or toti. Aristotle even uses this expression, which means to a certain something. The predicates and qualities are always and even the modes, time and space. That's why what makes Aristotle so much different from all his predecessors. And Marx rightly argues that Aristotle was an enormous influence on Epicurus. So anyway, in this argument, in this reading of a certain dialectics that of the atom that Marx recognizes in Epicurus's concept of the atom, his version of atomism, flashed out in De Rerum Natura by Lucretius Carus. So this understanding, interpretation of the atom, even though sounding, as I said, a little bit as a certain ontology of dialectics, or dialectical ontology, let's put it that way, because he keeps talking about the tension between the concept of atom and the real properties. And I just explained how I think these real properties are understood. And I believe they are understood in a way close to what I just explained about Aristotle's understanding of the relation between properties or qualities or modes in relation to a ousia, or even a certain to on or to ti. So I think that the use is very similar, and it also remains a fact that Marx never uses. So it resembles this move of ontologization of dialectics. We find in Hegel, as I said, I admit that, but not quite so, especially because he's cautious. Marx is cautious that, and he never says, the concept is in this tension with the properties, and this tension is then result. He says Epicurus postulates this and that in such a way. So there is this Kantian, let's say, distinction as to dialectics is on this side and Epicurus does this. But by doing this, he correctly explains the atom. And also, I began with that, so let's finish with that. Let's never forget that the concept of the atom wouldn't be there without the materialization of that concept. Hence, this, dialectics. Here, the use of dialectics does resemble an ontology, I admit. And this dialectics enables the concept to be there, but still, this is a radically materialist stance, because the concept wouldn't be there, but without the properties, without materialization, without the contradiction, and the dialectics this contradiction constitutes. So it's not the ideal, let's put it that way, or the concept, Marx uses the word concept, wouldn't be there without the materialization and this contradiction, or let's say tension or dialectics between that concept or ideal or notion and the material reality of properties. So I'll finish by reading the quote I have in mind, because you may have not noticed that it's in the footnote of the paper I sent you. So this is what I have been analyzing in the past 7 minutes, and this is a quote from the dissertation, and I believe this kind of shows that indeed Marx never abandoned his initial positions, elaborated or made clear, or let's say originally postulated but not fully developed we find in his dissertation. He has been, pursuing the same goals since the dissertation. So this is the quote. It's short. I will finish in less than a minute. He says, through the qualities, this materialization of properties, that's meant by qualities in Aristotelian sense. So, okay, let me begin again. Through the qualities, the atom acquires an existence which contradicts its concept. It is assumed as an externalized being different from its essence. It is this contradiction which mainly interests Epicurus. Hence, as soon as he posits a property and thus draws the consequence of the material nature of the atom, he, meaning Epicurus, counterposits at the same time determinations which again destroy this property in its own sphere and validate on the other and validate instead the concept of the atom. He therefore determines all properties in such a way that they contradict themselves. Democritus, on the other hand, nowhere considers the properties in relation to the atom itself, nor does he objectify here dissertation, nor does he, meaning Democritus, nor does he objectify the contradiction between concept and existence, meaning of properties or qualities, which is inherent in them. And I'm finishing here. There is one short quote, maybe a final sentence, again from the dissertation, which kind of dovetails to the quote I just read. It's the following: the contradiction between existences and essence, between matter and form, which is inherent in the concept of the atom, emerges in the individual atom itself. Once it is endowed with qualities, through the quality, the atom is alienated from its concept. And that's why I keep arguing, and I kept arguing in that book, The White Radical Metaphysics of Socialism, that there has always been this argument in Marx about this original alienation in human subjectivity as well, in the question of human subjectivity as well. Okay, this was a digression of mine. It's not part of the quote. So let me finish the quote. Through the quality, the atom is alienated from its concept, but at the same time is perfected in its construction. It is from repulsion and ensuing conglomerations of the qualified atoms endowed with qualities, he means, that the world of appearance phenomenology, right, now emerges. So I chose these two quotes as something that I think kind of displays the influence of Hegel in early Marx in the dissertation, but also shows Marx's early departure from the general idea of Hegel, in particular when it comes to dialectics. So I'm done. I'm sorry, I'm like took how many minutes more?
That's totally fine. Thanks, Katerina. That was awesome. That I was like distracted just paying attention. I'd lost track of the time. That was fine. It'd be great to hear more. I have questions and thoughts. Thanks for reading those last two quotes too, because those are really so important. And just the dissertation is very dense, and those quotes I find to be just so illuminating. And I think I wanted to read one or two of them in the last class, but we just ran out of time. But just getting through the material, so I'm glad that you read them so closely like that. Yeah, so lots to say. So everybody, I know you have questions and notes, so like I'm gonna talk for just a bit about Lucretius and Epicurus, and then save your questions and thoughts about what Katerina was saying just till after I'm done, which I'm going to try to take another 30 minutes as well, and hope to get through it. So yeah, so what I want to say is sort of about, yeah, I also agree with everything Katerina was saying. It's really very, very important. And some of the quotes I said before about objects align really closely with what she was saying, because they're taken from that same section in Hegel's critique of, or Marx's critique of Hegel's system about subjectivity and objectivity. It's super, super important, especially for a lot of Marxists. Like what Katerina is saying is very important, because a lot of Marxists are just anthropocentric, and they don't see that there's any problem with this at all philosophically. In part, maybe because they didn't read the dissertation, or maybe they didn't read his closely the critique of Hegel. Like, but I agree with what Katerina was saying. It seems to me that Marx was not anthropocentric. He had a place for humans as part of a natural world, as part of a social world. They're a metabolic process like everything else. They're not the basis of, like, it's not like everything, all of reality is a projection of their mind or something like Hegel makes it. Anyway, I digress. Let me move on to the things, so what I want to say, the argument here is that I want to sort of give you some evidence for, is that Marx's reading of in the dissertation, I told you before that he cites in the dissertation, even though often he's talking about Epicurus and he says Epicurus says this or this is going on, it's important to remember one important quote from that dissertation where he says, nobody understood Epicurus in the ancient world except Lucretius. That's very revealing that he thinks Lucretius understood more than anybody else, or maybe the only one who actually understood him. That is a way of saying and suggesting that Marx is very much reading Lucretius. He is citing Lucretius. I told you he has 2 notebooks of his 5 or 6 notebooks that are just about close readings of Lucretius and translations of the text. He is reading Lucretius very, very carefully, and he is drawing conclusions in some ways out of Lucretius's reading and Lucretius's text about Epicurus. And I think he's partly doing his own thing, because some of the things Katerina was saying about Epicurus, you really have to read between the lines when you read Epicurus on that stuff, because no Epicurean would walk away with what Marx did. It's not obvious, and Epicureans are like, well, first of all, they don't even read Marx, but if they did, they'd be like, no. But it's not like there's no evidence. Marx gives lots of evidence, but he's coming from his own perspective, his own motivations. And as Katerina is saying, those motivations are the critique of Hegel and the critique of religion. And he's doing it through Epicurus, and he's citing and engaging with Lucretius. So this is to say, if you track them down, at least half of his citations and engagement in that dissertation are with Lucretius, even though Lucretius is not in the title of the dissertation. Okay, that's just to say that what Marx was getting at was much closer to what Lucretius was doing than what people typically think Epicurus was doing, and what people typically think Lucretius was doing, because they read Lucretius as just having copied the master, Epicurus. And so they read Lucretius and Epicurus are totally identical. And so I've spent the last decade writing 3 volumes, close reading Lucretius, to show the following things. And I'm going to just tell you some of the big theses of those 3 volumes that I've worked out in detail, but here I'm just going to give kind of schematically to show you that what Marx is doing is way more consistent with Lucretius. And if you encounter people who say, how is that accurate depiction of Lucretius, I want to give you some little key things to investigate further and to think about when people say that Lucretius was just like their version of Epicurus. The first one is the swerve. The first idea is so important to Marx's dissertation. It's what makes his dialectical method really, truly different from Hegel's, is the swerve. Hegel does not like the swerve. And sometimes when even people interpret the swerve, they think about the swerve as being just like random. And it's really important that I just have to emphasize that the swerve is not just random. It's not like anything happens in the swerve. Some people think about it that way, and I'm just going to cite 2, but we could go on a laundry list of people. Contemporary thinkers like Alain Badiou, French philosopher, Louis Althusser, and his focus on the swerve. These are Marxists sort of reading Marx's dissertation, but coming away with something very different than I think is supported in the text, which is that the swerve is just random, like anything. And then one extreme version of this is Kenton Meyasu, another student of Badiou's, who talks about a hyperchaos. And for Badiou, it's very important that the event is just completely aleatory. It has no precursors. And to me, Badiou says in a line, he says, I have the most materialist philosophy of anybody since Lucretius, who had the most materialist philosophy. And it's funny because Badiou completely doesn't have a materialist philosophy, in my opinion. This is my reading, is that he very much wants to, but his materialism is extremely formalist, mathematical, and ideal. But he wants it to be very material, and he wants it to be aligned with Lucretius. But the big disjunct there is that for Badiou, the event has no precursors. It is completely random. It emerges, it can emerge anywhere out of anything. And for Lucretius, the swerve is very much relational. And I'm just going to give you an example. I mean, it's clear, certainly from Katerina's description in the dissertation, that Marx gets that right. Marx sees that the dialectic is relational. Something responds to something else. There's a back and forth, there's a transformation. It's not just like anything can happen. You know, this kind of Boltzmann interpretation, if just to reference a thinker Katerina mentioned, but for Boltzmann, just like anything could happen out of nowhere. That's not, Lucretius really explicitly gives examples why that never happens. He's like, roses bloom in the spring, grapes ripen in the fall. Okay, it's not, you know, the grapes aren't ripening and the winter, it's not happening. The swerve isn't random. Not anything can happen. Things are relational and things transform and evolve. There's not some kind of radical event the way that Badiou poses it. Okay, sorry, that's just maybe too much background, but I really do want you to remember moving forward, whenever you hear anybody talk about the swerve, that the swerve is not random. And what makes it materialist is that it's relational. And what makes it dialectical for Marx is the relations, not that it's just random swerving. It's not like the nature of things is just randomly doing things. It's relational, and it's partly the relationality of matter with itself, the repulsion and the interaction and so on, that make it iterative, and give us patterns of seasons and cycles and you know, natural reality and metabolic patterns and so on. This is all stuff that Badiou doesn't care about, but I think it's really at the core of Lucretius and of Marx's dissertation. Okay, so anyway, the swerve. The thing I have to say that's very big about this is, I know Marx goes on and on about Lucretius's swerve, but I have to tell you that Lucretius never mentions the swerve. We don't have any text where we find Epicurus talking about the swerve. All the places where you would think he would say it, if it was so important to him, he doesn't. 3 letters that he wrote to Herodotus that were meant to be like, here's some letters to teach students about what Epicurean atomism is. And he never mentions the swerve. He describes his complete philosophical system, and there is no swerve. The Greek word is paraklesis. Obviously, there's a Greek word, and it's not the swerve, or it's not clinamen or declination. It's paraklesis. Epicurus, we have no text where Epicurus talks about paraklesis or describes anything like a swerve. The reason why people think that there was a swerve in Epicurus, and I think he probably said something at some point about it, and I think it was probably later on in Epicurus's work. We have fragments of his collected work, 30-something volumes called On Nature, that Epicurus wrote, that we're still digging out fragments. My guess is that in the next decade, we'll probably get some more Epicurus fragments. But right now, and none of those fragments, we have all the titles of the chapters of his book on nature, Epicurus's lost book on nature. But the book itself is lost. The fragments themselves mention nothing that suggests anything about paraklesis. However, Philodemus was a contemporary Epicurean of Lucretius's. But Philodemus was like the real deal. He was like a really true Epicurean, you know, studied in Athens and wrote all in Greek and everything. And he was a contemporary of Lucretius. Lucretius was not like an Epicurus scholar. He was not part of the indoctrinated orthodoxy of Epicureanism. He read it, but he took it as inspiration for something else. And so he's definitely modifying it. And anyway, my point here is that Philodemus does say in one place, that we have only one place, Philodemus says, Epicurus mentions paraklesis. Doesn't seem like much hinges on it. Probably it was a response actually to Aristotle's criticism of Democritus and Epicurus, that it was just, you know, he was like, this is a completely deterministic system. Where's the freedom? And Epicurus's response may have been something about the swerve. Now, does all matter swerve? Who knows? Is it just the human soul that swerves? Not clear. We just have no text. So when anybody starts talking to you about Epicurus's theory of the swerve, you should raise an eyebrow and say, where are you getting that? Because we have almost nothing about it. We have nothing from primary, and even from the secondary sources, they're writing often after Lucretius. Some before or contemporaries, Philodemus, but they're writing after Lucretius. meaning that they might have just taken what Lucretius said and said, I'm sure Epicurus said something like that because surely Lucretius was a good Epicurean. Well, was he? We don't actually know that, how good he was. We don't know what, because on this question. Anyway, this is just to say, I'm flagging this for you because the swerve is super, super important. Marx is pulling a lot on the swerve in his theory of dialectics. Where is he getting it? Lucretius, not Epicurus. Okay, Marx never read a single word about the swerve in Epicurus. Nobody, well, maybe not nobody ever, but most people hadn't. Okay, so if it's out there, we have no record of it. But Marx is drawing on it very heavily, and it's very, very important. And I just want to flag for you that that comes from Lucretius. Whatever Epicurus did, and I think he probably did mention it, Lucretius takes the swerve and he makes it really, really important. He puts it all over the place. Turbulence and swerving and contingency and all these things end up in Lucretius. And that is a key source for Marx. The second one, and I mentioned this, I think only just flagged it earlier, is the atom. This is another interesting moment here that is very consistent with Marx's reading. Because, you know, for Marx, Marx is not an atomist. Just like Katerina was saying, the atom is just this concept. And matter is what makes it possible for humans to come up with concepts like atom. But what is the process, the material process that makes it possible for humans who are material processes to then abstract and say atom? You know, and Marx's answer is absolute immanent motion, transformation, change, material process. That process is what's going on. And then as the process emerges, it can produce humans who then look back at the process and say, oh, it's like atoms bouncing around and emerging and conglomerating. But that's not what was happening. That is an idea that we have about it, which is inadequate to the material process itself. Now, Lucretius knew this. This is consistent with Lucretius's position. In Lucretius, there is not, he never says the word atom. There's not a Latinized version of the Greek word. He never uses the word particle. Lucretius did not say anything about billiard balls bouncing around against one another. And I'm going to tell you exactly the words that he said. He never even has a single word when he talks about matter. Also, there's never matter in the singular. He always uses matter in the plural. And this is, again, I'm telling you this because this is only obvious once you dig into the Latin. If you look at English translations, they put the word atom in there. It was never there when they put in the singular of matter, but that wasn't there. They've singularized matter. And this is a bias of English translators that are influenced by the history of a modern reception, thinking of Bacon and Newton and so on. That is the idea even that Epicurus maybe had discrete little billiard ball particles. You have to think about the history of the modern reception of that. These were scientists who were thinking about mechanistic causality and wanting a world that was definable by natural laws. So they have a kind of bias in reading Epicurus and Lucretius. So if you go back to the Latin text without that bias and just bracket for a moment that Lucretius was not a, or the idea that Lucretius was some kind of Epicurean fundamentalist, I give you the following three words. There's more, but I'm going to just give you three and show you that they have nothing to do with particles, billiard balls, causal, mechanistic, whatevers of the modern scientific revolution in Europe. Instead of saying atom, Lucretius says at least three I'm going to talk about. Semina. So semina is a Latin word that means, it can mean sprout, it can mean like branch, it can mean like a graft, like when you graft a tree branch onto a tree and then it starts to grow. It is a kind of, it's an outgrowth, if you will, like sort of this, like a little branching outgrowth. It can also mean seed, which of course the seed contains, if you've watched a seed grow, you could see that it's not some billiard ball. Seeds are not billiard balls. If you know anything about biology, you know seeds are not billiard balls. Seeds are insanely dynamic processes that unfold out of themselves. Marx loves seeds. They're totally dialectic in his sense. Like he has all these images too in Capital, these kind of, especially chapter 1 where it's very poetic. He gives these images of kind of plant growth and eggs, like he's talking about sort of eggs and wombs, and they're dynamic. They're not just billiard balls that are causal and self-identical. The idea of the atom, the way that most people think about it, they're like, oh, it's supposed to be this perfectly homogeneous thing. Well, we know, first of all, that's not true in physics. It's not true, and it's also not true for Lucretius either. Anyway, it's a dynamic. The second term is corpora. So again, these are all used in the plural. These in the Latin, and then they're singularized often in translations. Corpora. So corpora in Latin can mean body. It can also mean, which again doesn't mean singular body, but bodies or bodiness. You know, like corporeal in the English, we have this word corporeal that just means kind of bodily, is maybe the best way to think about that, instead of a single homogeneous body, but something bodily. And it can also mean tree trunk, or the sort of bark and the trunk of a tree would be like a corpora. The other word is materies. So materies, this is the word sort of closest to the English word matter. And it comes from, speaking of archaeologies of materialism, Katerina, it's a totally different lecture that would take me too long, but I have a lot to say about this particular word, some of it which I'm sure you already know about, the history of this word. A Latin word, matter, it's related to our English words, not just matter, but also mother. So mater means mother. This word also is matrix, which is also tree. So this connection between tree, mother, and matter, you might think, well, why the heck is tree associated with matter? I mean, if ever, like, why is that the go-to way to think about what matter is why call it a tree? And the Latin answer is the Greek word. It comes from the Greek usage, which was Aristotle's. Prior to Aristotle, there was not a Greek word for matter, like a concept of matter in general. Aristotle was the first person to try to do that with the Greek word hule. And so hule just meant like tree or forest, or woodland area. And so he picked that. I mean, it's a good question of why, and that's the part that will take me down a long track back to the Minoans. But I'm just going to give you a bit of a spoiler and say this has to do with a very archaic Greek tradition, and even pre-Greek tradition of tree worship. That the religions and worship, and I mean, if you will, non-Greek or early pre-Greek philosophies of trees and the religious worship of trees is very, very important to those pre-Greek people. And then it has all this reception that I can't go through now. But I'm just going to say that's where the Latin comes from, is tree. To sum up about the atom, there's no atom for Lucretius. There are like trees and sprouts and branches and growth and all of that. That's the image of matter for Lucretius, not billiard balls knocking around. Growth and branches and trees. Those are the words he uses, and that is what they mean. Okay, next concept, stasis. This is a big difference. So in Epicurus, there's lots of usage of the word atom, and that's a whole separate thing. What exactly he meant by that, you could just take it to be continuous or indivisible, or you could think about them as particles bouncing around in Epicurus. In any case, Lucretius has a very different idea that is much more consistent with what Marx is saying. The next idea that's very different between Epicurus and Lucretius is stasis. So for Epicurus, part of the ethical ideal, he says there's two different types of pleasure. There's katastematic pleasure, which is these are moving. No, wait, is that the moving one? I'm forgetting now which one it is. There's sort of static pleasures and kinetic pleasures. And Epicurus is against the kinetic pleasures. He wants the static pleasures, which is to say, for Epicurus, the ethical ideal is contemplation. The highest kind of pleasure you can have is just the elimination of pain. Everything on top of that, you're risking engaging in something that's going to cause pain. You're desiring something which you might not get, something which might result in pain. And so it's best just to like eat bread and water and hang out in the garden and contemplate the gods. And that's very important, is that it's a kind of immobile pleasure that happens through the mind. Epicurus was a rationalist. That is part of the ethics. It's part of the structure of contemplation. You're supposed to think about the gods. And for Lucretius, this is very obviously not what's going on. In fact, there's a handful of wonderful passages I'd love to go through if I had the time to show you, but I'm just going to highlight one, which is at the beginning of book 3, like of De Rare Natura, in lines like 32 through 36 or something in book 3, where Lucretius is saying, like, he's saying all these nice, well, this complicated stuff about Epicurus, but basically when he says, when I read the pages of Epicurus, I'm like a bee and I buzz around and I'm in a field of flowers, and he makes this, great kind of pun using the word like pages and leaves, like leaves of a book and leaves of a flower. And Lucretius says he's like a bee buzzing around, drinking from the flowers, and he's spilling it, and he's kind of getting intoxicated on the pollen from the flowers, and he's getting intoxicated on Epicurus's writing. And there's a great footnote in the Loeb that says, Lucretius couldn't possibly mean this word, because this would imply that he was spilling and he was sloppily going through the pages of Epicurus. The Loeb is like the most conservative translation written by like some white dudes in the 1920s, but like they have a very narrow conception. Like, it seems weird because Lucretius isn't doing something Epicurean. You're like, yeah, that should be a flag for you that's more is going on than just him as a receiver of Epicurus. So anyway, he drinks all this, he reads the pages, and then he goes into this absolutely ecstatic rapture. And the entire universe unfolds before Lucretius's eyes, and he starts to shake and quiver in awe of all of the universe. And like, no, Epicurus, if Epicurus knew that Lucretius had wrote that, he would have said, that's not what I intended. That was not the purpose. When you read my text, you should be a good rationalist, contemplate the unchanging, peaceful gods outside the universe, and just chill out. And Lucretius is like going into ecstatic poetic frenzy when he's sort of digesting and becoming intoxicated. Anyway, there's a million things we could say, but that's one of my favorites. That's most dramatic, that no Epicurean would ever say. No Epicurean could ever ethically support that. Okay, on to the gods. I forgot what time I started, actually. Katerina, will you like flag me just when I'm reached 30? I've totally lost track.
You haven't reached 30, but you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, 5 more minutes.
No,
okay,
wait.
This is.
When did I end? Almost 6:40. So you have until 10 past 7. So I mean, okay. 7-hour time. So.
Okay, is
so
that
you
1
have
minute?
5 more minutes. Let's
5
say.
more minutes. Okay. Then this is
okay,
this is the last.
But I took 3 more, so you can take 8 more minutes.
No, it's totally fine. So this is my last point about the gods. Okay. Anyway, in Epicurus, so Epicurus believed in gods. People think about Epicurus as a radical materialist, but I mean, as a and Lucretius as well. But they often say things too, like Epicurus believed in the gods, and Lucretius also believed in the gods. Okay, Epicurus definitely believed in the gods. There's a special word, metacosmia, no, that's not it. There's another word, but it's like it's between the worlds. So there are many worlds, and the gods live between the worlds. And people often, it's really funny. I mean, it's actually kind of crazy that we could get this far in the scholarship, and people still use this word intermundia. Like, oh yeah, the intermundia. I mean, Marx does actually in Capital. He has a footnote about Epicurus and intermundia. But the thing is, intermundia is a Latin word, not a Greek word. The idea is that Lucretius also believed in the gods living in between worlds, intermundia. Just like when people talk about, the clinomen in Epicurus. No clinomen in Epicurus. That's a Latin word, never used by Epicurus. Paraclesis would have been the Greek word. But again, no evidence of usage in Epicurus either. It's a really kind of crazy oversight, in my opinion, in the scholarship that this could be so distorted. In any case, the word intermundia does not appear in De Rerum Natura. Lucretius never says the gods exist or that they exist outside the world. Here's what he actually says, and from the reading where these sites are, but there's 3 or 4 places explicit where Lucretius says this. He's giving kind of history of where humans came up with the idea, and he says it was in dreams. Humans had dreams about gods, and they imagined that there were gods, and they came up with these kind of divine simulacra. They're just images that are in our heads. The gods are not outside the world. They are our ideas that we come up with, and they're very naturalistic. And there's more to say about the mythology and so on that Lucretius invokes. But Lucretius is very explicit in Book 5 that the gods do not exist, and we came up with them in our dreams early on, and then we sort of forgot at a certain point. The other thing to say about the gods is, but this also changes the ethical possibilities for Lucretius. If there are not gods outside the world, then there is nothing static to contemplate. Again, For Lucretius, everything is moving, everything is swerving. If that's true, you cannot have an Epicurean ethics, because Epicurean ethics is a rationalism about stasis and the peace. The gods are peaceful. The gods have everything they want. They don't give a shit about anything. And that's why when you contemplate them, you don't care about anything either, and you just feel good. Well, you feel not bad. That's the technical. You feel not bad, and that's the highest pleasure you have for Epicurus. But if you don't have static gods, and you don't have static bodies, and you don't have a static rational soul to contemplate those gods outside the world, you do not have Epicurean ethics. So Lucretius cannot have an Epicurean ethics because there are no gods, there's no stasis, there's only swerving. We can have metastable moments, we can have moments of ecstasy. There's lots of different things that are going on that I can't get into at this moment. But one last thing, and then I'll stop, which is that for Epicurus, this is one of the consequences of Epicurus's belief in the gods, is that Epicurus himself, and he instructed his followers to participate in religious rituals of sacrifice and of honoring the gods. And Epicurus said, this is an important thing that we should do, even though we know the gods will never reward us and they'll never punish us because they're outside the world and they don't care about us and they're just fine on their own. Ataraxia is his idea, just peaceful, unpainful world of the gods. Epicurus says, even though the gods don't care about us and they can't affect us, we should still participate in religious rituals and sacrifices and so on, just to keep up the social fabric of society. Now, Lucretius is extremely against this. This is what happens in book 1 with the sacrifice of Iphigenia. When Agamemnon, there's a big storm and Agamemnon has to go out with his troops to go into the Trojan War, but the storm is keeping them from leaving. He says, well, actually a seer says, there's a prophecy and like, this is Artemis and she's, upset. So you need to appease her by sacrificing your daughter. And Lucretius, this is all an example. So, Agamemnon goes to sacrifice his daughter on the altar. Well, he actually tells her that she's going to marry this guy, and she gets really excited. And then she shows up, and he's like, "Sorry, we're going to kill you instead. You're not getting married." And that was a dark moment for her. But the good news is, at the very last minute, Artemis swings down, saves Iphigenia, and then gives her a kind of quasi immortality. Some of at this point, the myths kind of diverge. One story is that she is kind of quasi-immortal. Another one is actually she becomes the kind of companion and lover of Artemis. But anyway, she's rescued from her horrible father and sort of given, a place. But I mean, it's weird that she's rewarded in that way. Anyway, it's complicated. You have to read the passages for yourself. But the point is, Lucretius's whole story is, look what believing in gods does to you when you start sacrificing to them. When you think that the gods will reward or punish you, you start doing crazy stuff like sacrificing your daughter. Religious worship, like in terms of that the gods will reward or punish you, if you keep doing that, it's going to lead you to terrible consequences. And this is very weird. Lucretius is very against it. Epicurus is very much for it in his life. Okay, now I think I've probably gone over a little bit, so I'm going to stop.
Are you sure? Don't you have a couple of closing sentences? Okay.
No, I don't. That's it, actually.
Okay.
Those are just fragments. The whole point there is just to say that I think the things I've just said, no gods, no stasis, no atoms, and the swerve is very important. These are all features of Lucretius's work that very few people have seen. And Marx was one of the people who saw them. And this is just my hypothesis about this, is that Marx read Lucretius like crazy. And then when he says Lucretius is the only one who understood Epicurus, it's kind of like he's saying, I'm really reading Lucretius here. I'm reading Epicurus through Lucretius, but I'm reading Lucretius in a very different way. And so that's why I think Marx just has a wonderful a contribution that inspires his version of materialism. It comes out of a very unique and I think true reading of Lucretius.
Okay. So we're moving on to the part where we discuss with the students. But before that, I want to ask you one thing. I don't know if you have studied this closely, if you have examined the dates, the facts, whether Lucretius appears in the rerum deorum, of the nature of God. Sorry, of the nature of gods by Cicero, where he accuses Epicurus of inventing the swerve and therefore distorting the Democritus and true science. Or what's good in atomism. Do you believe that that's Lucretius's perhaps influence, or the influence of the Epicureans in Rome, that he does not get it directly from Epicurus or earlier fragments in Greek?
Well, so it's a good question. Ultimately, I think we don't know. We don't have enough textual evidence, but here's what I would say just based on what we do have. Is that so Philodemus was like a serious Epicurus scholar. If he said it, it's probably true. Like so Philodemus is like such a scholar. Everything that Philodemus writes, it's like doctrinal Epicureanism. It would be pretty unlikely, again, we can't say for sure, but it'd be extremely unlikely that Philodemus would have invented Paraclesis and then attributed it to Epicurus. That would be very uncharacteristic of Philodemus. So the fact that Philodemus says that Epicurus had this idea it's as close as we're going to get to believing, in my opinion, Philodemus is the source that is most reputable. It's the closest we're going to get to saying Epicurus actually did have this idea of the swerve. Then after Philodemus and after Lucretius, you get Simplicius, Cicero, Plutarch. All of them are going to be both aware of something of Philodemus and of Lucretius. And that's where I think it becomes much messier, because they're writing after Lucretius and they might have assumed that Lucretius was just echoing Epicurus when that's not obvious. We don't have evidence to suggest that that's what's going on, because we don't have any direct evidence of Epicurus talking about the swerve. So we can't say, here's Epicurus's idea of the swerve and here's Lucretius's. We just really don't know. All we have is Lucretius's idea of the swerve.
But Cicero is a bit older than Lucretius, right?
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying once Cicero is writing about the swerve, it's not, even though he's saying, oh, Epicurus's swerve, it's not obvious to me that he's necessarily not just reading Lucretius and assuming. That's why all the sources after Lucretius are to me slightly more problematic, because we don't know how much they're just attributing to Epicurus based on Lucretius. That's why Philodemus to me is the real source.
Philodemus is which era, which year, let's say, which century?
He's a bit older, so he's 1st century BCE. He's a bit older than Lucretius, but they're contemporaries. They're living at the same time. Yeah. So Philodemus was a living in Rome, but he was a Greek scholar of Epicurus.
Okay, I'm not sure either. That's why I'm asking you.
I know. I mean, I'm sorry that the truth is nobody actually knows exactly if that's true or not. Maybe Cicero says that, but
basically contemporaries, right?
But it's a good point that you bring up, because what it shows to me and philosophically is important. That's like Cicero, Plutarch, nobody likes the swerve. And Marx goes, in the dissertation, Marx is like, look at all these people who totally didn't understand the swerve. They hated it. And these aren't like modern, these are like, people, ancients writing after Lucretius that are like, this is the worst idea in the history of philosophy. It makes no sense. There's no way that matter can just swerve on its own. How dare you undermine science, knowledge? The project of totality is impossible now because of the swerve. And it doesn't make any sense for them. And I think this is one of the things that attracts Marx to the swerve, and that for him makes it truly a materialist idea, is that it makes it not about mechanism, causality, billiard balls. And in The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx has a very long section about the history of materialism. If you want to see what Marx thinks about the history of materialism, that's a very good section to read, because he just kind of goes through the history of materialism, and he's like, here's why all these other materialists are wrong. and he doesn't say it there of like, here's why Lucretius was right, but it's in the dissertation.
Yeah.
And so those sections from you know, the Holy Family only make sense in the, like, if you've read the dissertation, you're like, oh, because Marx doesn't spell out in the Holy Family like, here's my theory of materialism. He mainly just criticizes everybody else. And then you have to know that he wrote the dissertation, which was his theory of what matter was based on Lucretius. But he does say things like, you know, these other readers totally misunderstand Epicurus and Lucretius. But he doesn't say, I wrote a whole dissertation about it or anything. You just have to know that he did. But I think it's crucial that very few materialists have ever been able to seriously affirm the swerve. And I think the people who have gotten closest, I mentioned before Deleuze, and now Badiou and Althusser, these are, you know, they took it seriously in some ways. Like, they read it, they see that it's important, they see it's part of the materialist tradition, that it's part of the Marxist tradition, which is great. They're in the minority of people who think that the dissertation and the swerve is really important to Marxism, but their interpretation is they're just willing to affirm the thing that Cicero thought was bonkers, which is matter just swerves randomly out of nowhere. And Badiou's like, yeah, it's just random out of nowhere. And I think read Marx's dissertation. Marx doesn't say it's random. He says that it's about the swerve and then the repulsion. It's matter moving with itself, against itself, transforming itself. It's a constant immanent dialectic. Importantly, an immanent dialectic, like not what the hell Badiou says, which is just this like not immanent dialectic. It's a completely fragmented, formalist, mathematical that he calls dialectic for reasons I can't possibly imagine why, and his explanation is very unsatisfying. Anyway, there's questions, but maybe you have thoughts about Badiou and Althusser too, Katerina, at some point. I'd like to hear them.
Well, I don't know enough about Badiou and his stance on this issue, on the swerve. I don't know. I may have encountered it, but never really noticed it. So, but it's interesting. I learned a lot, actually. It's very interesting. I'll probably read what he has to say on the matter.